Think your job is tough? Imagine being 10 years old, ripped from your family, and dumped in a stone castle where your daily to-do list includes scrubbing blood off armor, dodging flying hooves, and getting smacked with a wooden sword until you stop crying. This wasn't a punishment, it was the path to knighthood. But behind every sir was a kid who barely survived the boot camp from hell. In this video, we dive deep into the brutal, humiliating, and downright dangerous life of a medieval squire. One wrong move, you're out, or worse. Stick around, because it only gets more intense from here. Imagine being just 10 years old and sent away from home, not to summer camp or boarding school, but straight into the grinding gears of medieval warfare training. No hugs, no goodbyes, just a quick prayer and a swift boot into a lord's castle. That's where your new life began. Not as a pampered page or polished knight, but as a squire. You weren't there to play dress-up. You were there to break. Or prove you wouldn't. Most kids today complain about chores or homework. Try waking up before sunrise to polish a full suit of armor that weighs more than you do. And not just once, every single day. Miss a spot, and your knight might accidentally trip you into a pig trough. You'd haul water, muck stables, fetch weapons, scrub boots, tend to horses, and stand at attention while your lord slept off last night's wine. Your daily reward? Blisters, bruises, and maybe, just maybe, a pat on the back. If you were lucky. The road to knighthood wasn't some heroic Instagram reel of sword fighting and noble speeches. It was a brutal grind. Squires were medieval interns with no union, no weekends, and zero sympathy. You trained under real threat, often alongside men who saw you as expendable. You were a human guinea pig in combat drill, a live test dummy for new techniques. You'd better memorize your knight's equipment down to the last buckle, because if he fumbled in battle, it was your head on the chopping block. And speaking of heads, your own might be cracked open if you didn't learn to handle a weapon fast. Combat training wasn't padded with foam swords or overseen by cheerful coaches. It was real, raw, and ruthless. Wooden swords gave way to steel, blunted only slightly to minimize fatal accidents. Squires sparred until their arms went numb. You'd train in chainmail to build strength, chase after mounted knights on foot for endurance, and practice aiming a lance from horseback until your thighs screamed. Ever tried horseback riding without a saddle for hours while wielding a 6-foot spear? Now add a full belly of gruel and no bathroom breaks. And here's the kicker. None of this was optional. Skipping a drill wasn't met with detention. It earned you a flogging or kitchen duty so vile you'd pray for the training yard. One chronicler noted that squires often smelled worse than their horses. That wasn't an insult. It was a fact. Still think you could handle it? The glory came with humiliation, too. You were expected to serve your knight at meals, often kneeling beside him while he feasted and you starved. And don't even think about sitting unless told. You weren't just a servant. You were visible proof of your knight's authority. That meant fetching wine, holding the chamber pot, and even, yes, helping him dress, down to tying his codpiece. And the social hierarchy was unrelenting. You could be the son of a nobleman, sure, but that didn't stop older squires or knights from roughing you up to toughen you. Hazing wasn't banned. It was encouraged. A broken nose was a rite of passage. Falling off a horse was a joke. Crying, that got you kicked out. Or worse, branded a coward for life. What most don't realize is that squires weren't merely prepping for war. They were living in its shadow every day. Castles were military zones. If your lord marched to battle, you followed. If he died, you'd better fight your way home, or die trying. The 100 Years' War, the Crusades, constant border skirmishes, these weren't distant tales. They were job hazards. One 14th century account from the Siege of Calais describes squires scavenging arrows from the dead while under fire because supply lines were too slow. Another notes a squire who had to finish off his own mortally wounded knight to save him from enemy torture. Think your internship was intense? And training wasn't just physical. It was psychological warfare. You were drilled in loyalty, honor, silence. You learned not to flinch at screams, not to hesitate at cruelty. Some lords would test their squires by ordering them to kill a captured animal, or worse, a criminal. Not as punishment, but as practice. Could you swing a blade without trembling? Could you wipe blood from your cheek and keep marching? Even downtime wasn't downtime. When not in combat drills or servitude, squires studied warfare, heraldry, etiquette, and languages like Latin and French, because diplomacy mattered. You had to write reports, send messages across enemy lines, and sometimes spy on rival nobles. One wrong word, and your head ended up on a pike. Literally. Modern boot camps, no matter how grueling, at least have medics and mental health days. A medieval squire's recovery plan? Bite a stick and hope the leeches worked. Medical care was primitive at best. A twisted ankle might never heal right. A deep cut could fester into gangrene. And showing weakness? That earned contempt, not compassion. Now imagine going through all this for years, 6, 7, sometimes 10 years, without any guarantee of becoming a knight. The path wasn't automatic. You could be passed over, forgotten, or killed before your dubbing ceremony ever came. Some squires were injured so badly during training or battle, they ended up as permanent servants or lowly guards. But those who endured, those who didn't crack, didn't cry, didn't die, were transformed. They became knights forged in fire, men who'd seen real suffering and still rode into war with discipline and pride. Their armor wasn't just steel, it was scar tissue and resolve. And still, the question lingers. Could you handle it? Could anyone today? Because up next, we're going deeper, into the darker, dirtier grind of a squire's daily routine. The moments nobody sings about in epic poems. What did it really look like to serve, survive, and suffer under a medieval knight, day after day with no exit in sight? If the sword drills didn't break you, the daily grind probably would. Life as a medieval squire wasn't all blood and glory. Most of the time, it was just filth, fatigue, and frustration. You weren't just training to be a knight. You were surviving as a glorified servant in a world where privilege didn't mean comfort. You were at the beck and call of your knight, his household, and often his horse, from sunup to sundown and beyond. Every morning began with chores, and no, not the kind where you take out the trash and earn allowance. Try waking before the rooster crowed, hauling buckets of icy water from the well, and scrubbing your knight's armor until it shone like silver, despite the rust trying to eat through every rivet. The weight alone, anywhere from 40 to 60 pounds, meant you needed arms like a blacksmith just to carry it. Then came the horses. You groomed them, fed them, mucked out their stalls, polished saddles and stirrups, and did it all while dodging kicks, bites, and the kind of manure that would make a porta potty smell like roses. And you didn't dare complain. Not if you wanted to keep your teeth. Older squires and even some knights treated the new ones like punching bags with legs. It was all part of the process. Get tough or get out. Many castles didn't have the staff to coddle young nobles, so squires learned by doing, badly at first, then better if they survived the feedback, which often came in the form of a slap, shove, or humiliating public scolding. After chores, you'd maybe choke down a crust of bread and watery ale. Milk was for babies, and water was often unsafe. Breakfast wasn't a meal. It was fuel. Because next came combat drills, and those made the stables feel like a spa day. Training fields were muddy, cold, and brutal. You'd spar with wooden swords so heavy they could break your fingers if you slipped. Your partner? Maybe a friend. Maybe a brute with something to prove. You'd drill footwork endlessly, learn to block, parry, thrust. Then came polearms, lances, halberds, and staffs, long, awkward weapons meant to be used in close quarters and on horseback. And oh yes, you trained on horseback too. Riding without reins, fighting with one hand, staying mounted when someone tried to knock you off with a padded lance. And the padding? It was more for the horse's sake than yours. By midday, your muscles burned, your arms trembled, and your shirt stuck to you with sweat and blood. Your own or someone else's. There was no break room, no water cooler, just a field littered with exhausted boys and impatient masters barking orders. Still think medieval kids had it easy? And even after the physical beatdowns, you weren't done. The mental drills came next. You had to memorize heraldry, every banner, sigil, and color associated with every noble house in the realm. You studied tactics and history, often copying texts by hand because books were rare and scribes weren't exactly cheap. Some squires could read Latin, others learned just enough French to shout surrender orders if needed. You also practiced table manners, public speaking, and religious rituals. Why? Because a knight wasn't just a fighter. He was a symbol of order, piety, and prestige, and you were his understudy, whether you liked it or not. Afternoons meant more chores. Maybe you escorted your knight to court. Maybe you ran messages between towers. Maybe you were cleaning up after a hunting trip, gutting deer, or carrying the hawks. Every day was different. Every day was exhausting. And then came dinner, your one real chance to eat if your knight was feeling generous. You stood by while he dined, always alert, always quiet. If he wanted wine, you poured it. If he dropped a bone, you picked it up. Some lords tested their squires by giving them specific silent commands: raise a torch, draw a dagger, fetch a scroll, just to see how fast and discreet they could obey. Mess up, and you were the dinner show. Some got slapped with greasy turkey legs, others got banished from the hall. One infamous story from a 13th century Yorkshire manor tells of a squire who spilled wine on his lord's lap and spent the next week chained to the gatehouse in winter. That wasn't rare, it was regulation. And if you thought bedtime was relaxing, think again. You slept on straw, maybe in a shared loft or beside the horses. You stayed ready to wake at any shout or trumpet. Night attacks weren't common, but they weren't rare either. Castles were targets, and squires were expected to spring into action with zero notice. Some knights even staged fake attacks to see who panicked. If you ran or hid, you were done. What's worse, squires often trained with live steel in dim candlelight. Imagine balancing a sword drill after 16 hours on your feet, in flickering shadows, with the weight of failure, literally, on your shoulders. This wasn't character building. It was a trial by fire, one you didn't always survive. And yet, this wasn't considered cruel. It was necessary. Medieval society didn't have room for soft hands or slow reflexes. Every noble house needed warriors who could ride hard, fight dirty, and die with honor. Squires were forged under pressure because knighthood wasn't a status, it was a survival mechanism. Now consider the psychological toll. Boys grew up fast, or not at all. You were expected to keep your emotions in check, your loyalty absolute. No tears, no fear, no doubts. Some squires wrote secret letters home, begging their families to bring them back. Most got no reply. You belong to your knight now. His house, his rules, his wars. And those wars were never far. If your knight rode into battle, so did you. You carried his gear, held his horse, and when it got bad, you fought beside him. Not as a knight, but as a last line of defense. You could be 14 years old and holding a sword against grown mercenaries. There are records of squires dying in full-on melees, trampled by cavalry or struck down while trying to shield their lords. But for every tale of tragedy, there were victories too. Some squires distinguished themselves early, saving lives, capturing enemies, winning tournaments. These moments were rare but golden. They could fast-track you to knighthood, even earn you your own coat of arms. But they came at a steep cost, usually paid in sweat and scars. Modern teens worry about SATs or job interviews. Medieval squires worried about battlefield deaths, public shame, and total physical collapse. Yet somehow, they endured. Not all, but enough. Enough to keep the system going. Enough to train the next generation of bruised and battered boys who dreamed of wielding a sword not as a servant, but as a knight. So now that we've walked a day in their mud-caked boots, we'll take a closer look at what happened when squires were finally thrust into real battle. Because training was one thing, war was another, and most of these boys had no idea just how fast that leap would come, or what it would cost. No matter how many drills you survived or how well you memorized heraldry, nothing could fully prepare a medieval squire for his first real taste of battle. It didn't matter how many tournaments you'd watched or mock charges you'd run in the field. The first time the horns blew, the gates swung open, and the world erupted in steel and screams. That's when the real test began. And the jump from chore boy to battlefield runner wasn't gradual. It happened fast, often with no warning. One moment you were oiling your knight's chainmail, the next you were tightening the girth on his warhorse while soldiers screamed orders all around you. Your heart pounded like a blacksmith's hammer. Your hands shook. But you didn't stop. You couldn't. Because once war came to your doorstep, your job expanded in ways no manual could cover. You weren't just fetching lances. You were securing armor in the middle of chaos, guiding panicked horses, and keeping a sword ready for when your knight needed it. Sometimes you were even expected to finish what he couldn't. If he was wounded, it was your task to drag him off the field. If he was unhorsed, you gave up your own mount. If he died, you either took up arms or ran for help, and neither choice came with much chance of survival. One infamous campaign in the early phases of the 100 Years' War saw entire columns of squires riding directly into enemy lines just to retrieve fallen knights or capture heraldic banners. Capturing a banner could mean ransom money. Losing one meant disgrace. So squires, barely into their teens, were tasked with preserving the honor of entire noble houses, even as arrows darkened the sky. This wasn't theory. It was recorded at battles like Crécy in 1346, where French squires, some as young as 12, rode unarmored to collect the wounded while English longbows cut down everything in their path. Chroniclers didn't romanticize it. They just noted how many didn't return. And if you were sent to war abroad, say during the Crusades, things got even worse. You faced disease, dehydration, and total cultural disorientation. You might not speak the local language. You might not recognize the banners. You might march for days only to arrive at a siege where the smell of rot hung in the air like smoke. One knight wrote home from the Levant, describing how his squire was slain by filth before any blade, likely from dysentery or infected wounds. Because in medieval warfare, nature often killed faster than steel. But even when you weren't on the front lines, war meant pressure. You had to prepare your knight's equipment with absolute precision. A missing gauntlet could mean a lost hand. A loose girth strap could lead to a fatal fall. You were the last link in the chain of readiness. And if your knight failed in combat, you were often blamed alongside him. What's worse, your own training didn't stop. Even during campaigns, squires continued to drill. You trained beside mercenaries, archers, and hardened veterans who had no patience for mistakes. They'd strike you down in mock duels without hesitation, sneering if you flinched. You learned dirty tricks, eye gouges, knee shots, shield bashes, because honor was for the poets. On the field, survival trumped chivalry every time. And speaking of chivalry, it's not what you think. The code wasn't some gallant oath to protect the weak and cherish truth. It was a loose collection of expectations, mostly enforced among nobles, not peasants or foreigners. You were expected to obey your liege, show bravery in battle, and respect church authority. But you could still torch a village, slaughter prisoners, or trample farmers if it served your lord's campaign. And you'd be expected to watch and participate without question. Modern soldiers undergo months of psychological screening and team-based exercises. Squires? They got a prayer, a kick in the backside, and the hope they'd learn fast. The battlefield was your classroom. One wrong lesson, and your story ended in a shallow grave. The worst part? You often didn't even get a weapon until things were truly dire. In many armies, squires carried gear and stayed behind the lines, but when the fighting came close, they were thrown in. Grab what you can, swing until it's over. Swords, maces, axes, anything lying around. Your shield might be a barrel lid, your armor might be borrowed or scavenged, and still, amid all the horror, there were chances to prove yourself. A squire who showed bravery might be knighted on the spot, a rare honor called knighting on the field. It meant recognition in the heat of battle, witnessed by peers and superiors. You might even receive the fallen knight's horse or armor. But these field promotions were earned in blood, often while dragging a sword through mud so thick it sucked the boots from your feet. There's a chilling account from the Battle of Bannockburn in 1314, where a squire named Thomas of Moray reportedly held a narrow bridge for 10 minutes after his knight fell, using a broken spear and a corpse as cover. His stand allowed reinforcements to arrive, and he was knighted later that day, after nearly dying from blood loss. Stories like that were whispered in every castle, not to inspire, but to warn. Because for every Thomas of Moray, there were dozens whose names were never recorded. Boys who died nameless in the muck, trampled under hooves or cut down by someone they never even saw. The path to knighthood was littered with broken bodies and unfinished dreams. It wasn't a reward, it was a gamble, and most lost. After the battle, if you survived, your work wasn't done. You tended the wounded, gathered spoils, buried the dead. Sometimes you looted corpses, friend and foe alike, because supplies were short and survival trumped decency. One squire's memoir describes prying a ring from a severed finger, then vomiting behind a tree. He was 12. This was the crucible in which medieval knights were forged. Not the tournament field, not the banquet hall, but the smoke-choked horror of real war. If you cracked, faltered, or failed, there was no second chance. Your knight might fall. Your comrades might die. You might end up a captive, sold for ransom, or worse, tortured or enslaved. So when modern people picture shining armor and heroic charges, they're seeing a fairy tale. The truth was mud, blood, fear, and 1,000 tiny choices that meant life or death. For the squires, every battle was a final exam, and the cost of failure was everything. And still, even after surviving combat, the journey wasn't over. Next came the long, uncertain road toward actual knighthood. Not everyone made it. Not everyone wanted it once they saw what it really meant. Because up next, we'll uncover the bitter reality of what came after the battle, when squires returned home, changed forever, and faced the ultimate question. Were they truly ready to be knights, or had war carved something else into them entirely? Coming home from battle didn't mean rest. For a squire, it meant reckoning. You'd been through bloodshed, seen comrades die, maybe killed someone yourself, but you weren't a knight yet. Not officially. And that gap between battlefield and brotherhood could stretch years. Worse, it could stretch forever. See, knighthood wasn't a guaranteed promotion. It wasn't a medal for surviving. It was a calculated decision made by your lord, your family, or sometimes the king himself. And the criteria? Not just valor, but politics, wealth, connections, and reputation. You could be the bravest squire in 5 counties, but if your knight thought you lacked polish, or worse, made him look bad, you might find yourself back in the stables, cleaning tack and licking wounds. And that was the best-case scenario. Some squires came back broken, mentally, physically, or both. Limbs lost, faces scarred, minds rattled. There were no therapists, no pensions. A squire with a shattered knee became a servant, a clerk, or a liability. A few were taken in by monasteries. Others wandered as beggars. One chronicler from 12th century Normandy describes a former squire who spent his post-war days mumbling prayers in Latin, pacing a ruined chapel until he died of exposure. Nobody even knew his name. But for those who endured and still wanted the title, the final steps were almost as grueling as the path that led there. First came the inspection. Your lord or patron would examine your service record, weigh your behavior, and often solicit opinions from other knights or clergy. Had you shown loyalty, temperance, piety? Could you recite the code of chivalry without fumbling? Could you ride, fight, and serve with grace? One false step, one drunken outburst, one insult at court, and it could all vanish. Then there was the cost. Being dubbed a knight wasn't just a ceremony. It was an investment. You needed armor, a horse, a sword, and often a shield bearing your own coat of arms. All of that added up to the medieval equivalent of a luxury car. Families went into debt to fund their sons' knighthood. Others relied on patrons or begged for second-hand gear. And if your family was poor, you might spend another decade as a squire praying for a chance. Some never got it. They aged out, sidelined into permanent squireship, a role with none of the glory and all of the labor. A few found employment as household guards or mounted messengers. Others drifted into mercenary work. But they never earned the title, Sir. But for those deemed worthy, the path culminated in a ritual that was equal parts sacred, political, and theatrical. It began with a night of prayer. The squire would bathe, symbolically washing away sin, then dress in white as a sign of purity. He'd fast, attend mass, and spend hours kneeling in silence before the altar, often with his sword laid beside him. Then came the ceremony. In front of nobles, clergy, and sometimes royalty, the young man would be presented with his arms and armor. His spurs were fastened, his sword belted, his shield handed over. A respected knight or lord would tap his shoulders with the flat of a blade, sometimes 3 times, sometimes once, and pronounce him a knight. The words varied, but the message was clear. Rise and serve with honor. Sounds poetic, right? Until you remember what came next. Knighthood wasn't a free pass. It was a vow, and a binding one. You were now expected to live the ideals you'd trained under. Bravery, loyalty, piety, mercy, and courtly behavior. You were sworn to protect the weak, uphold justice, and obey your liege. But in practice, that meant you might be summoned to war at any time, asked to put down peasant revolts, collect taxes, escort nobles, duel rivals, or lead men into battles you didn't start, and you'd be held accountable. A knight who dishonored himself could be stripped of title, land, or worse. Some were excommunicated for crimes against the church. Others were publicly disgraced, their armor smashed, their swords broken. The same world that cheered your dubbing could jeer your downfall. Worse still, the psychological shift could be jarring. As a squire, your purpose was clear: serve, endure, obey. As a knight, you now had agency and consequences. You made decisions, you swore fealty, you rode at the front, you bore the brunt of command. And if your choices led to disaster, others paid with their lives. Some knights couldn't handle that. They became tyrants, drunk on power and paranoid of betrayal. Others withdrew, burying their trauma in silence or drink. A handful, like William Marshall, perhaps the most famous knight of the 12th century, balanced duty with wisdom, earning respect across multiple reigns. But even Marshall spent decades fighting, watching friends die, and facing betrayal at every turn. Knighthood wasn't a fairy tale. It was a political minefield wrapped in steel. And let's not forget love, or the lack of it. Knights were expected to marry well, forge alliances, produce heirs. But courtship was often a chess game of dowries and titles. Passion took a backseat to strategy. One knight described marriage as another campaign, with silk instead of steel. That's not exactly Shakespeare. So if you'd hoped knighthood meant freedom, you were in for disappointment. Yes, you had status. Yes, you were called sir. But you also had duties, endless ones. Patrolling borders, resolving land disputes, enforcing your lord's will, attending court, and training your own squires. The cycle began again, with you now in the role of mentor, inflicting the same brutal routines you'd once endured. Some knights broke that cycle. They trained their squires with more patience, tempered discipline with empathy. Others doubled down, believing hardship forged strength. But either way, the legacy of your squires reflected on you. Their failure was your disgrace. Their success was your redemption. And in the end, knighthood wasn't a destination. It was a burden, one carried until death, on the battlefield, at court, or in obscurity. You didn't retire. You just grew old, slower, and more vulnerable, until someone younger replaced you. But before that end came, many knights faced one last moment of truth, not in war, but in peace. Because with your title came land, and with land came peasants, people who depended on you for protection, justice, and leadership. Some knights rose to the occasion. Others became petty tyrants, taxing their tenants into ruin. One English peasant revolt in 1381 specifically targeted brutal knights who'd enriched themselves while the poor starved. The message was clear. Your sword might win wars, but it wouldn't protect you from the rage of those beneath you forever. So, after all the battles, the bruises, the discipline, and humiliation, a knight had to ask, was it worth it? Because next, we'll reach the end of the road. We'll follow the arc to its final beat, the legacy left behind, the toll taken on the body and soul, and what it really meant, in the twilight years, to have once been a squire. By the time a knight reached old age, if he ever did, his body bore the full ledger of a squire's brutal beginning. Scar tissue mapped every joint, bones creaked with every movement, and eyes that once scanned battlefields now squinted at the fire. Some sat by their hearths with grand tales and sons eager to follow their path. Others sat alone, forgotten by courts that once begged for their service. Either way, the boy who'd once scrubbed boots and tasted fear as a squire had long vanished. But traces remained. It started in the way they moved. Slow, stiff, but always with purpose. Years of armor left their mark. Knees ground with every step. Shoulders sloped from too many falls. Arthritis was a given. Some knights couldn't even mount a horse by 40. And still, they were expected to show up, to lead, to judge disputes, train squires, attend church feasts, and recite the code of chivalry like it hadn't been trampled a dozen times over in every campaign. That code, so exalted in poems, was rarely followed to the letter. Older knights knew this too well. They'd seen noblemen burn villages and priests bless it. They'd watched just wars devolve into slaughter. And they'd learned, painfully, that loyalty was conditional. Kings fell, lords betrayed, allies turned rivals, but a knight swore to endure. That endurance often came at a cost, not just physically, but emotionally. Many old knights carried the weight of decisions made decades before. Men they'd killed, oaths they'd broken, innocents they couldn't save. There were no confession booths deep enough to unburden that kind of history, and few spoke of it aloud. Shame was a private ghost. Still, some did find peace, or at least a purpose. Teaching became a refuge. An aging knight might take on a young squire, seeing in him a reflection of the terrified boy he once was. He'd bark commands with the same ferocity he'd once loathed, then soften his tone when no one watched. He'd tell half-truths about the glory of war, because the full truth would crush the boy's spirit before it even grew. Yet not every knight could hide the disillusionment. Some retired to monasteries, trading swords for scripture. Others sought redemption on pilgrimages to Jerusalem or Santiago, dragging their battered bodies across continents in search of absolution. And a few, those who'd lost everything, simply disappeared, left their lands, changed their names, vanished into the peasantry or outlaw bands, leaving behind only rumors. The rare knight who lived well into old age and kept his estate often became a local legend. Villagers would whisper about his past, pointing at his scars, his rusting armor, his ancient blade mounted above the hearth. Children would sit at his feet, begging for tales. But even then, he'd likely leave out the worst of it: the hunger, the fear, the friend who bled out because there was no time to save him. Those were memories not fit for fireside stories. And through it all, the same haunting question remained. Was it worth it? Had the years of servitude, humiliation, and war earned anything more than a title and a plot of land? Had the code of knighthood meant anything when every campaign seemed to contradict it? Some said yes. They pointed to stability, prestige, and the chance to leave a mark. Others said no, and they had the broken families, shattered villages, and personal regrets to prove it. What's undeniable is that knighthood left a mark, not just on the man but on the society around him. Castles were built by their victories. Borders were held by their sacrifices. Laws were enforced by their swords. And their squires, those wide-eyed boys forced to grow up too fast, became the next generation of enforcers, protectors, or destroyers. And yet most of them had started the same way. Too young, too scared, too eager to please. There's a tragic poetry in it. A boy sent away from home, stripped of identity, forged through pain, and then expected to carry civilization on his shoulders. He was trained to kill, then asked to rule, conditioned to obey, then told to lead, taught to repress emotion, then expected to inspire. It was a system designed not to nurture, but to test, to weed out the weak, reward the ruthless, and shape survivors into symbols. And while a few emerged with honor intact, most bore the hidden cracks of what they'd endured. But society needed its knights, not because they were perfect, but because they were hardened. So what became of them in the end? Some died on battlefields, their names carved into stone or lost to the mud. Others passed in bed, surrounded by children who never saw the blood behind the stories. And a handful? They lived long enough to question everything. To look back on the long road from terrified page to hardened knight and wonder, was there another way? Could the same strength be forged without so much suffering? It's easy to admire the shining armor, the gallant pose, the legend. Harder to reckon with the bruises beneath. The truth is, the medieval squire's life was never a tale of simple hardship overcome. It was a crucible that tested humanity to its edge, often past it. And the final irony? Many of the knights who endured it all would not recommend it. They'd look at their broken fingers, their aching joints, their nightmares, and tell a boy to think twice, not because they regretted serving, but because they knew what it had taken. So the next time you see a statue of a medieval knight, sword drawn, eyes fixed on the horizon, remember the boy behind the blade, the squire who polished that armor with bleeding hands, the child who endured fear, cruelty, and exhaustion for a dream of honor. And ask yourself, could you have survived it? Because he did. Barely. And the cost? It was everything. We've romanticized the knight for centuries, armor gleaming, banners flying, honor shining bright. But peel back the legend, and you find a much darker truth. Behind every knight stood years of brutal discipline, emotional isolation, and physical torment endured as a squire. These weren't heroic beginnings, they were survival stories, and most wouldn't make it today. So how far have we really come? We've swapped swords for screens, sure, but are our modern rites of passage really so different? What would happen if we held ourselves to the same level of grit, sacrifice, and service? Let us know in the comments. Could you have survived life as a medieval squire? Or would you have tapped out at mucking the stables? If you learned something new or had your idea of medieval life turned upside down, hit that subscribe button, tap the bell, and join us next time on Medieval Daily. We're just getting started.